The first time it happened, it didn't feel like an attack. It felt like one of those casual, throwaway remarks people make when they assume you won't mind because you're easygoing. I remember standing there, half listening, half distracted, completely unaware that this tiny moment would eventually grow into something much bigger. Their tone was light, their expressions relaxed, and yet something in the way they looked at each other after the joke landed told me more than their words did. It was a look of shared amusement, a subtle confirmation that they could say things like that and get away with it. At that point, I hadn't yet realized how deeply mockery hides itself in the little things, how it begins quietly, almost politely, before it eventually shows its real face. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. Everyone jokes, everyone laughs, that's what I said to myself. I didn't want to make a scene out of something so small, something that didn't seem worth reacting to. But disrespect rarely shows its full shape in one moment. It comes in pieces, testing you slowly, feeling out the boundaries of what it can get away with. And so the next joke came sooner than I expected, a little sharper this time, a little more intentional. I caught the shift in their tone, the slight smirk afterward, and the quiet glance they exchanged, the kind that says, "Did you see that?" I said it, and they didn't react. That was the beginning, though I didn't understand it yet. The jokes kept coming, soft at first, then firm, then blatant. What started as teasing turned into comments that lingered in the air longer than they should have. They began choosing moments when they knew others were around, because mockery feels safer when it's supported by an audience. They measured the room, tested my silence, and every time I let it pass, they grew bolder. People often believe quiet individuals don't notice things, but quietness is not blindness. It is observation. And I was watching them more closely than they realized. I started noticing patterns, how they picked specific moments when I wasn't fully engaged, how they spoke softly but loud enough for everyone else nearby to hear, how their smiles widened only when I didn't respond. They treated my silence like permission. Mockery needs approval, and because I didn't challenge them, they assumed they had it. It wasn't that I didn't feel the sting, it was that I thought reacting would only escalate things, and I didn't want to give them that satisfaction. But mockery doesn't want to be ignored. It wants to grow, stretch, and spread until it defines the entire atmosphere around you. There were days when I wondered if I was imagining it, if maybe they weren't mocking me intentionally. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But then the laughing would start again, quiet at first, then louder, then followed by those looks, the ones people give when they believe they are clever enough to insult you without consequences. And that's when I realized it wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. They weren't just teasing, they were building a pattern of disrespect, testing how far they could push, testing how much of myself I was willing to let them take without fighting back. The mockery changed form over time. It shifted from jokes to comments about how I worked, how I spoke, how I moved, how I reacted to things around me. They started turning my strengths into punchlines, twisting my qualities into something they could laugh at. They did it in subtle ways too, the raised eyebrows, the hidden chuckles, the exaggerated reactions whenever I made a simple suggestion. And every time they did it, they watched me. They wanted to see if I would break, if I would finally react, if I would give them the emotional explosion they were hoping for. But I didn't, and that only encouraged them further. There were moments when I caught myself questioning why people do things like this. Why mock someone who has done nothing to provoke you? Why target someone who simply exists peacefully? But the truth is simple. Some people need someone to look down on because it makes them feel taller. Some people create their confidence by cutting someone else's down. And because I wasn't fighting back, I became the easiest choice, the safest target, the one who wouldn't disrupt their comfort. Eventually, the mockery didn't just come from them, it started influencing others around us. People who barely knew me began treating me with a strange mix of amusement and pity, like they had absorbed the idea that I was someone to laugh at, someone whose presence meant nothing more than entertainment. The atmosphere shifted, and suddenly I wasn't seen as a person, I became a character in their little game. And that is the dangerous thing about mockery. Once it starts, it spreads. It becomes a culture, a habit, a rhythm people fall into without even realizing how cruel it really is. But even then, I stayed silent, not because I was weak, but because I was thinking. Observing. Waiting. Mockery may begin loudly, But revenge doesn't. Revenge begins in the quiet moments when you start to understand exactly what is happening and exactly what needs to be done. They thought I was ignoring their jokes, but in reality, I was memorizing them. I was learning the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they behaved when they believed no one would challenge them. Their mockery was building something inside me without them knowing, laying the foundation for a reaction they were never prepared to face. Silence is a strange thing. People think it means weakness, that it reflects a lack of confidence or power. They see someone who doesn't respond, someone who absorbs the moment quietly, and they translate that stillness into surrender. That's exactly what they did with me. They interpreted my calm as fear, my patience as insecurity, my restraint as inability. It never crossed their minds that silence can be a choice, a strategy, a shield that reveals far more about them than it ever hides about me. They didn't realize that silence isn't the absence of strength, sometimes, it's the sharpening of it. Whenever they mocked me, I chose to hold myself steady. Maybe a part of me hoped that if I didn't react, the situation would dissolve on its own. Maybe I believed they'd get bored, lose interest, or realize on their own how unnecessary their behavior was. But the more I remained silent, the more they took it as validation. Silence, in their minds, was an open invitation. They thought it meant that their words didn't affect me, or worse, that they had the right to continue. They couldn't understand that silence was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of discipline, the kind they had never learned and would never understand. The thing is, silence makes people reveal themselves. When you don't react immediately, when you don't give them the emotional fireworks they expect, they start showing you their real intentions. I saw their confidence grow. I saw their jokes get bolder, their smirks get wider, their disrespect become more polished, more rehearsed. They thought they were untouchable simply because I didn't engage. They believed they had discovered a part of me they could manipulate and play with. And so, they did what people always do when they mistake quietness for helplessness, they pushed further. They would speak in exaggerated tones when I entered a room, making sure their comments were loud enough for others to hear. They looked at each other for approval before laughing, as though waiting for silent permission to continue humiliating me. They commented on my decisions, my habits, even the way I carried myself, and each time I didn't react, they collected that silence like a trophy. They crafted a narrative where I was the one who lacked courage, the one who didn't know how to stand up for myself, the one who could be dismissed without consequence. In their heads, they were powerful because I didn't argue back. But the truth was far different on my side. I wasn't silent because I had nothing to say, I was silent because I wanted to understand. I wanted to see the full picture. I wanted to know who they became when they thought I was defenseless. People show their truest selves not when challenged, but when they believe their actions will never be challenged. And they showed me everything, their arrogance, their entitlement, their hunger for validation, their cruelty disguised as humor. It was all there, plainly visible, as long as I didn't interrupt the performance they were so eager to put on. There were moments when I watched them with a kind of detached curiosity, almost like I was observing a story unfold. Their behavior wasn't simply about me, it was about who they needed to be in order to feel significant. Their mockery was just a reflection of their own insecurities. My silence didn't create their behavior, it revealed it. Still, the more silent I remained, the more they convinced themselves that I was incapable of defending myself. They didn't understand that silence can be a form of intelligence, a way to gather information, a way to let someone underestimate you so completely that they never see the reversal coming. I remember certain days when the silence between us carried more weight than their insults. They'd say something sharp, something intentionally pointed, and I'd feel the sting in my chest. But instead of reacting, I'd breathe in slowly and let it pass through me. I learned how to contain the hurt, how to redirect it inward not as pain, but as understanding. Silence became my filter, I allowed their words to reach me only long enough to understand them, not long enough to define me. They thought I was absorbing the damage, but I was actually storing the truth, that their mockery said more about who they were than who I was. Eventually, their belief in my weakness became almost laughable. They spoke with a confidence that came from ignorance, not strength. They treated me like someone without edges, someone without depth, someone who would stay exactly where they placed me. And every time they misjudged me, Every time they mistook my quietness for defeat, they unknowingly gave me more power. They gave me the advantage of their assumptions, the element of surprise, the upper hand that comes from being severely underestimated. Silence allowed me to see how they built their courage on the foundation of my supposed passivity. It taught me how easily people become bold when they think the other person won't push back. It revealed who supported them, who encouraged them, who stayed quiet for the wrong reasons. It showed me the social structure surrounding them, the invisible threads that connected their confidence to the approval of others. And while they thought I was shrinking, I was actually expanding. My awareness grew, my understanding deepened, my desire for change intensified. The more they misinterpreted my silence, the clearer my path became. Every insult, every laugh, every whispered remark helped shape the decision forming inside me. They believed silence was a sign of surrender, but for me, it was preparation. Silence allowed me to choose my moment, to wait for the right time, to build something within myself that wasn't driven by anger alone but by clarity. They believed they knew who I was, but they only knew the version of me that silence allowed them to imagine. They didn't realize that silence can be the beginning of something far greater, something they would never have predicted if they hadn't mistaken it for weakness in the first place. It didn't happen during one of their louder moments or in the middle of a crowded room where everyone could see. It happened quietly, almost subtly, the way life often delivers the moments that change everything. I remember the exact sound of their voices, not loud, not dramatic, just sharp enough to cut through the air. It was one of those remarks made with full confidence that I wouldn't say anything back, one of those lines they thought would slip past me because that's what had always happened before. But something about this moment felt different, heavier. It didn't wash over me the way their previous insults had. It landed. It settled. And for the first time, I didn't let it pass through me, I let myself feel it. I felt the shift before I even had the words for it. It was like the atmosphere around me cracked open for a second, revealing something I had ignored for far too long. The remark wasn't just a joke this time, it was designed to humiliate, crafted deliberately to place me beneath them. There was no hesitation in their voice, no hint of uncertainty. They had grown too comfortable, too confident, too sure that I would continue playing the quiet role they had assigned to me. And that was the moment that stirred something inside me, something I hadn't touched in a long while, the realization that my silence had allowed them to create a version of me that wasn't true. I looked at them, really looked, and I saw the ease with which they dismissed me. I noticed how they leaned back slightly after making the comment, like someone who believed they had just proven a point. The others around them laughed, not because the joke was particularly clever, but because they had become conditioned to laugh whenever I was the target. That laughter, light and careless, echoed in a way it never had before. It wasn't the sound that bothered me, it was what it represented. It was acceptance, agreement, a shared understanding that this was the role I was meant to play. And that's when the turning point arrived, not as an explosion but as a realization. I realized I had given them permission without ever meaning to. My silence had not been interpreted as strength or patience, it had been read as approval. They had taken my restraint and shaped it into weakness. They had built an entire identity for me that I never asked for, one that didn't belong to me. And in that moment, I knew something had to change. I couldn't continue letting them define the story. They had written too many chapters already, twisting my quietness into a narrative I didn't recognize. The moment their words hit me that day, I felt the weight of all the unspoken responses I had buried inside myself, all the times I had s. Their comment that day wasn't special, it wasn't sharper or more cruel than the others. What made it different was me. I had changed. Or maybe I had finally reached the point where the version of me they saw no longer aligned with who I truly was. Something inside me shifted, a quiet unraveling, a slow awakening. I saw clearly, maybe for the first time, how deeply I had allowed their mockery to shape the space around me. And once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. The remark they made was small on the surface, but it flipped a switch in my mind. I remember feeling a kind of calm anger, not the reckless kind that pushes you into impulsive decisions, but the focused kind that sharpens every thought. It wasn't rage, it was clarity. It was the understanding that I had let them write too much of the story and that it was time to take the pen back. They believed their joke was just another line in the ongoing script they had created. They had no idea that this particular moment would become the point where everything began to change. I didn't react immediately, I didn't need to. The power of the turning point wasn't in what I said or did right away, it was in the decision forming quietly inside me. I realized that people don't cross the line all at once. They do it inch by inch, testing to see how far they can go. And that day, they took one step too far. They crossed a line I hadn't even known existed until that moment. It was the first time I truly understood that their behavior wasn't going to stop on its own. People don't stop hurting you just because they've done enough damage, they stop when you stop them. That was the truth I had avoided for too long, the truth that finally reached me the moment their joke landed differently. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't confront them. I didn't even let them see that something had shifted inside me. The turning point wasn't something they witnessed, it was something I carried within myself. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that things would not continue the way they had. I wasn't going to allow them to keep defining my role in their story. I wasn't going to let their laughter shape my identity anymore. The moment they pushed me too far, they unknowingly awakened a part of me that had been silent, patient, observing. A part of me that was ready, finally, to strike back when the time was right. The turning point wasn't about revenge just yet, it was about awareness. It was about reclaiming the respect I had given too freely, the dignity I had allowed them to dismiss, the voice I had kept too quiet for too long. It was the moment I understood that change doesn't begin with action, it begins with realization. And that quiet realization became the beginning of a path they never saw coming, a path that would lead to a response they were never prepared to face. Preparation doesn't always look dramatic. It doesn't always involve loud declarations or visible determination. Sometimes, it begins with nothing more than a quiet decision, a decision to stop letting people shape you and to start shaping yourself. After that turning point, something inside me shifted, not with noise, but with direction. I began to notice the things I had ignored before. I paid attention to the details I used to overlook. It wasn't revenge yet, it was rebuilding. It was gathering strength piece by piece, not because I wanted to prove them wrong immediately, but because I finally understood what they had been trying to erase in me all along, my potential, my confidence, my worth. I started observing them more carefully, not as someone who felt targeted, but as someone who was studying a pattern. Every time they mocked me, every time they whispered behind my back, every moment they believed they had the upper hand, it all became data. Their behaviors formed a map, and I followed it quietly. I began to understand what triggered them, what inflated their confidence, what made them feel powerful. And in that understanding, I found the first pieces of my comeback. They had always assumed I wasn't paying attention, but I was paying attention more deeply than they could imagine. At the same time, I turned inward. I examined myself with an honesty I had avoided before. I asked difficult questions: where had I allowed this behavior to take root, and why had I remained silent for so long? Not because I wanted to blame myself, but because I wanted to know where to begin strengthening. The truth was, I hadn't been weak, I had simply been too tolerant, too forgiving, too hopeful that people would eventually correct themselves. But some people don't change unless they are forced to, and preparing to force that change required me to rebuild the confidence they had been chipping away at bit by bit. I began working on the parts of myself they tried to diminish. They laughed at my ideas, so I sharpened them. They mocked the way I worked, so I improved my methods. They questioned my decisions, so I learned to make them with more precision. It was quiet work, invisible work, the kind people don't notice until it's too late. They continued to underestimate me, and that underestimation became my greatest advantage. They didn't know the hours I spent strengthening myself mentally, emotionally, and even strategically. They didn't see how each insult pushed me harder, not toward anger, but toward capability. I also learned to control my emotions, not by suppressing them, but by understanding them. Anger can be powerful, but only when it's used with clarity. I didn't want to react impulsively and give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I wanted my response to be measured, precise, and unshakable. So I trained myself to stay still even when I felt the sting of their words. I learned to let the hurt settle without letting it define me. I focused on the outcome, not the moment. And slowly, preparation became discipline, and discipline became strength. People around me didn't notice the changes at first because they weren't supposed to. I didn't want my growth to be loud or obvious. I wanted it to be something I carried internally, something I could unleash at the right time. I worked on my skills, my mindset, my resilience. I started setting boundaries in subtle ways, not reacting to certain comments, not engaging with their attempts to provoke me, not giving them the energy they wanted. This confused them. They had grown used to me absorbing everything quietly, and now I was absorbing nothing. They saw a shift, but they didn't understand it, and that uncertainty began to unsettle them. There were moments when I felt the urge to confront them right away, to demand respect after all the disrespect they had thrown at me. But I kept reminding myself that timing matters. A comeback is not about striking first, it's about striking right. I didn't want a moment of satisfaction, I wanted a result that would shift the entire dynamic. So I held my silence, not out of fear this time, but out of strategy. I wanted to choose the moment they would least expect, the moment when their confidence would be at its peak, the moment when they believed they had finally defined me. As I kept preparing, I noticed small changes in myself. I walked differently, not because I tried to, but because I felt different inside. My thoughts became clearer, my reactions more intentional. I began to speak less, but with more impact. I carried myself with a quiet certainty that I never had before, and though they didn't understand it, they felt it. They could sense that something was shifting, something they couldn't control or explain. Their jokes became slightly more hesitant. They looked at me differently, not with respect yet, but with a flicker of uncertainty. I also realized that preparation isn't just about building strength, it's about letting go of the parts of yourself that kept you small. I let go of the fear of confrontation, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of disrupting the peace. I understood that peace without respect is not peace, it's silence forced into submission. I wasn't preparing to destroy them, I was preparing to reclaim myself. The more work I did internally, the less power their mockery had over me. They continued their behavior, unaware that I was no longer the same person quietly standing on the receiving end. I watched them closely, waited patiently, strengthened myself consistently. They mistook it all for the same silence I had always given them, but this time, my silence wasn't passive, it was powerful. They believed they were still in control, but control had already shifted. They just didn't know it yet. Because preparation, real preparation, doesn't announce itself. It grows silently until the moment it reveals its full force, and by then, it's too late for anyone to undo what is already in motion. When the moment finally arrived, it wasn't planned in the way people imagine revenge to be planned. There was no dramatic build-up, no perfect script, no grand announcement that the roles were about to shift. It came naturally, almost effortlessly, as if all the preparation, all the patience, all the quiet observation had simply led me to a point where responding became instinct rather than intention. They were doing what they always did, laughing, pointing subtle comments in my direction, assuming the day would unfold exactly as every day before it. They didn't realize that the version of me standing in front of them wasn't the same person they had mocked for so long. They had been speaking to a ghost of who I used to be, not the person I had become. The strike back didn't begin with anger, it began with clarity. I had reached a place where their words no longer rattled me or pushed me into defensive silence. Instead, they sounded almost predictable, like a script I had already memorized. And in that predictability, I found my opening. I didn't need to raise my voice, didn't need to meet their energy, didn't need to match their cruelty. All I needed was precision, a moment where the truth could be delivered so cleanly, so unmistakably, that it would cut deeper than anything they had ever thrown at me. When I finally spoke, the room shifted. Not because I was loud, but because I was steady. Because my voice didn't shake. Because I wasn't reacting, I was responding. I remember the exact phrase I chose, not designed to humiliate them, but designed to expose what had really been happening all along. It was a simple sentence, calm and firm, but it held every ounce of strength I had rebuilt. It pointed out their behavior without embellishment, without emotion, without apology. The moment the words left my mouth, something changed in their eyes. The smirks faded, not because they suddenly felt guilty, but because they realized that the person they thought they were control. The room grew still in a way I had never experienced before. Their laughter stopped mid-breath, hanging awkwardly in the air like something that had just lost its meaning. Their confidence cracked, not dramatically, but subtly, the kind of crack that spreads quietly until it becomes impossible to ignore. They didn't know how to respond because their entire strategy depended on my silence. They had never prepared for the possibility that I might speak, let alone speak with authority. They blinked at each other, waiting for someone to jump in, but no one did. For the first time, they were the ones who didn't know what to say. I didn't give them time to recover the rhythm they were used to. I continued speaking, each word measured, each sentence crafted with the same precision I had trained myself to hold. I didn't insult them. I didn't stoop to their level. I simply exposed the truth, how their behavior had gone unnoticed only because I had chosen not to react, how their mockery had been fueled not by strength but by insecurity, how their laughter had been nothing more than a shield protecting their fragile egos. They weren't prepared for honesty, especially not from me. They had built my character around quietness, and now I was rewriting that character right in front of them. Their confusion slowly morphed into discomfort. You could see it in the way they shifted their weight, in the way they avoided making eye contact, in the way their forced smiles faded as if someone had turned off a switch. They weren't used to being confronted, especially not in a way that didn't involve aggression. They wanted a reaction they could attack, something emotional they could twist into weakness. Instead, they were met with composure, with control, with the kind of strength that can't be mocked because it leaves no cracks to target. I didn't need to win an argument, I only needed to make the truth undeniable. What made the strike back so powerful wasn't the words themselves, it was everything behind them. Every insult I had endured, every moment of silence I had held, every piece of preparation I had done had led to this point. I had learned their patterns, their habits, their triggers. I knew exactly how to dismantle their confidence without raising my voice. I understood that revenge isn't about destruction, it's about revelation. It's about showing people the reality they tried so hard to hide from themselves. And when I spoke, that's exactly what I did. I revealed them to themselves, and they weren't ready to see it. As I finished, I didn't wait for their approval or reaction. I didn't need them to acknowledge what I had said. The power of the moment wasn't in their response, it was in the shift that had already happened. They were no longer standing above me. They were no longer the ones in control. Their entire dynamic had shattered the moment I stepped out of the role they had written for me. And as they stood there, speechless, I knew it was over, not in a dramatic sense, but in a fundamental, irreversible way. They could no longer return to the version of me they had created because that version no longer existed. The strike back wasn't loud, but it was final. It was a quiet reclamation of everything they had tried to take, my dignity, my confidence, my voice. And though the moment wasn't theatrical or explosive, it was powerful in a way that only truth can be. It wasn't about hurting them, it was about freeing myself. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about closure. And in that clarity, in that stillness, in that quiet assertion of self-worth, the balance finally shifted in my favor without me having to raise a hand or a voice. I realized that the strongest strike isn't always the hardest blow. Sometimes, it's simply the moment you decide you will no longer allow anyone to define who you are. The aftermath didn't arrive as a dramatic announcement or a sudden shift in the atmosphere. It came slowly, almost cautiously, like the room itself was trying to process what had just happened and adjust to a truth it had been blind to only moments earlier. People who had moments ago been so sure of their assumptions, so comfortable in their quiet judgments, began to move differently, speak differently, and look around as if trying to make sense of how they had misread everything so completely. There was an energy in the air now, one that felt like a mixture of discomfort, curiosity, and a dawning awareness that could not be ignored. It is strange how quickly a room can transform when the image someone had built in their mind suddenly collapses. They had thought they were dealing with an ordinary person, someone they could dismiss, someone they could shuffle aside without consequence. But now, after seeing the truth, after realizing the status and influence of the person they had tried to push around, their confidence dissolved into silence. You could almost hear the shift inside their minds as they tried to replay the moment, searching for the exact second they should have acted differently. The whispers began first, soft and scattered, carrying questions no one wanted to ask out loud. People glanced at one another, some embarrassed, some startled, some simply stunned by their own misjudgment. They had been so certain earlier, so sure that their actions would go unnoticed or unchallenged. Now they stood there, uncertain of where to look, their earlier arrogance folding into an uncomfortable awareness of how deeply they had just embarrassed themselves. A few tried to busy themselves with tasks that didn't need doing, hoping that activity might hide their discomfort, but nothing could cover the weight of realization settling over them. Even those who had played no direct part in the disrespect felt the tension gripping the room. They knew they had witnessed something. But the most noticeable change was in the behavior of the ones who had initiated the entire situation. Moments before, they had carried themselves with a certain confidence, the kind that comes from believing you're in control. Now that confidence cracked, replaced by frantic attempts to rebuild the dignity they had just shattered. Their voices softened, their movements became overly cautious, and their earlier certainty evaporated into thin air. You could see the panic they tried to hide behind forced smiles and poorly composed explanations. They were trying to recover something that could no longer be recovered. They were trying to mask the embarrassment of realizing too late that they had treated the wrong person the wrong way. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a realization like that, a silence heavy enough to change the entire atmosphere of a place. It isn't just quiet, it's filled with unspoken apologies, unasked questions, and a recognition that some lines once crossed cannot be erased. That silence settled over them all, wrapping itself around every corner of the room, refusing to let anyone escape it. Even those who normally thrived on bravado or authority found themselves suddenly careful, suddenly hesitant, suddenly aware that their behavior had been noticed and would not be forgotten. The room that once felt familiar now felt unfamiliar, reshaped entirely by a truth that exposed everything they had tried to hide behind their assumptions and their power plays. People who had barely glanced at the situation before now found themselves hyper-aware of every detail, analyzing the expressions they had missed, the tone they had ignored, the signs that had been there all along. They stood there trying to reconcile the person they thought they saw with the person now standing before them. And in that struggle, they began to see themselves differently too. They recognized how quickly they had judged, how easily they had accepted what they were told without question, how fast they had allowed someone to be mistreated simply because they did not fit into the image they had created in their minds. The realization didn't just change their view of the person they had misjudged, it changed their view of themselves. The aftermath lingered not in the shock of discovering who they were dealing with, but in the quiet, undeniable awareness that everything they had assumed had been wrong from the beginning. It reshaped the room, the people, the atmosphere, and the way each person carried themselves as they tried to navigate the weight of their own realization. And perhaps the most unsettling part was that no one could go back to how things were before, because once you see the truth behind the person you misjudged, once you recognize the reality you had ignored, nothing ever returns to the way it used to be.